Hello and welcome. Paul here once again. Now, in my last two lectures, we talked about the 5th and 6th centuries, the invasion and settlement of the Anglo-Saxons in Britain. We also had that bonus lecture on Beowulf, which was a little treat for you guys. Now, in this lecture, we will be talking about the 7th century, which is the period where we start to see the Anglo-Saxons rise to power. And it is also the period of the dominance of the northernmost Anglo-Saxon kingdom, Northumbria. We will also be looking at this map that I painted from when I gave this lecture at the Penda War, the largest medieval reenactment event in the U.S. I'll just let you guys get a good close-up look here. Now, this period almost could be considered a transitional period in the evolution of the Anglo-Saxons. It's a period where Christianity was spreading, churches and monasteries being built, kings being baptized, but it wasn't necessarily enforced. And many of the common people, a king's own warriors for that matter, were still pagan. Paganism was their parents' religion. It was the religion of their forefathers. It was ingrained in the English way of life. And even many Christians at the time still held on to old traditions like herb charms and believing in elves. Also, it's important to note that back then, becoming Christian was more than just a matter of celestial rewards. It wasn't just about receiving salvation. Back then, for kings, becoming Christian was a political move. It was a way to become more powerful, a way to be seen by the monarchs on the continent and the Pope in Rome as an emperor-like ruler, a true Bretwalda. The Anglo-Saxons, and also the Franks, saw themselves as the heirs to the West Roman Empire, which had just collapsed. And what's that old saying? When in Rome, do as the Romans do. And at the time, Britain was very much seen as an island of feuding barbarian tribes, not very civilized, and the spread of Christianity changed that. Now also, I try to be unbiased in my presentation, but much of the information we're given about this period is from a Northumbrian Christian source. This is, after all, the period of Northumbrian supremacy. Northumbria was the kingdom in the 7th century. It was a big learning center, a lot of monasteries. Now, much of this period is told through the glass darkly, so it's kind of a hard period to figure out. But the main source of information we have about it is from this book, Bede's History of the English Church and People. Now, Bede was a monk living in the monastery of Yarrow, which is near Newcastle upon Tyne. He wrote this about a century after this period, and much of it, I'm sure, was from stories he was told by his parents or grandparents, or that maybe he heard from bards. The rest of the work covers everything from the time of Julius Caesar up to his own, but many will say that the highlight of this book is everything he writes about Edwin and Oswald and the kingdom of Northumbria in the 7th century. So, much of what we know about this period is written with a Northumbrian bias, but regardless, you really can't take sides in this kind of history because we weren't there. And I say the same thing when I'm talking about the 5th century with King Arthur and his battles against the Saxons, and I say the same thing about the 9th and 10th centuries because I love Vikings, but I also love Saxons. we weren't there. And the 7th century was a time of tribal warfare all across Britain, and kings trying to expand their frontiers into their neighbors' kingdoms everywhere. And it wasn't about pagan versus Christian just yet. Wars weren't fought over religion in this period. They were fought over territory, frontiers, land. Spiritual differences caused tension, but there were many other factors. So I'm just going to do my best to tell it all like it is, all how it is presented to us, without seeming to favor either side, either kingdom, either religion. I'm just going to do my best. I'm also going to add another thing to clear up confusion later in this lecture. You may have gotten this concept from my last lectures, but I will clarify. I will use the terms English and British, meaning what they meant back then and not meaning what they do now. Nowadays, British is an umbrella term that includes the English. But back then, the English were the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. And the British were the Welsh, the Cornish, and the folk from the Hen Ogledd, or the Old North, all the kingdoms that became part of southwestern Scotland and northwestern England. Eventually, the English and the British just happened to share the island of Britain, or Albion, as it was called. So just remember that. The English means the Anglo-Saxons, and the British pretty much means the Welsh, the Britons. So here we go. So Northumbria's story begins in the 6th century, and it's really the story of two kingdoms. The first kingdom was called Burnie Xie, which covered the lands south of the Tweed and north of the Tyne, and is an anglicization of the old Celtic name Briniac. Now, next to nothing is known about the old British kingdom, nor anything about the first Angles to occupy it. The story of Burnie Xie often begins with a pagan warlord named Ida the Flamebearer, whom around the end of the 6th century made Bebbanburg his capital and built a fortress where Bamburgh Castle now stands. And he is said to be the one to really begin the Bernician royal dynasty. The second kingdom was called Deira, which was the lands south of the Tyne and north of the Humber, the Yorkshire area, basically. And this area was an important stronghold in Roman Britain. It was where the Romans built defensive works to protect the route to Hadrian's Wall. The Angles took the land from the native Britons about a century or so after the Romans left Britain. The two existed as neighbor kingdoms until sometime after Ida's grandson, Athelfrith, took the throne of Burnie Xie in 593. Now, the beginning of his reign was marked by many battles against the native Britons, Scots, and Picts. But around 604, he became the first king to unite Burnie Xie and Deira, forming the powerful super kingdom of Northumbria, all of the English lands north of the Humber. And Athelfrith did this through both marriage and conquest. First, he married a princess from the Deiran royal family named Akka. Then, promptly, he attempted to assassinate her younger brother Edwin to stamp out any rival claim to the throne. Now, that isn't really something you do nowadays when you get married. Try to murder your sibling-in-laws. But for a king in the Dark Ages, I would imagine that was more common. Plus, it wasn't until the High Middle Ages that heirs apparent were more fixed. During the Anglo-Saxon period, you had the system of ethelings, the Anglo-Saxon word for prince. Now, you could have multiple eligible ethelings who could potentially become king, but the one who would rule would be selected by the Witenagemot, a group of noblemen and warrior elites who gather in what was called folk moots, where they would collectively choose who the king should be. But that wouldn't stop an atheling from overthrowing whoever took the crown just with sheer force. So it was customary for whoever became king to pretty much murder whatever athelings they felt might pose a threat. And if you were an atheling and you wanted to live, you went into exile. Edwin did not want to get killed, so he went into exile. According to Bede, he traveled all across the whole of Britain, finding refuge in the courts of different kings. There is a claim made much later in the 12th century by Geoffrey of Monmouth, who we spoke of in my 5th century video. He wrote the history of the kings of Britain with all the stuff about Merlin and King Arthur. Now, Geoffrey says that Edwin stayed in the Welsh kingdom of Gwynedd in the court of King Cadfan, and there he befriended the young Prince CAD Wallen, only for them to both grow up, become kings of their kingdoms, and then go on to fight each other. Now, the fighting part is true, and I will get to that soon. The childhood friend part could be little more than British romanticism. The kingdom most associated with Edwin's exile is East Anglia, which at the time was ruled by King Redwold of Sutton Hoo fame. And if you watched my bonus lecture on Beowulf, you know that much about King Redwold. Now I'm going to talk about the story about King Redwold and and Prince Edwin. What supposedly happened, according to Bede, was that Redwold was tempted to betray Edwin to Athelfrith for payment, but his wife convinced him that was not the honorable thing to do, and Edwin was assured that all will be well by a stranger who supposedly was Paulinus of York, an Italian bishop on what was known as the Canterbury Mission. So I guess Edwin made a promise to convert to Christianity as a condition of Redwold having his back and supporting him with the army to defeat Athelfrith. The ironic part of that is that Redwold never fully committed himself to Christianity. He accepted Christ, but he didn't stop worshiping Woden and Thunor, and as we can see at the Sutton Hoo burial, he was given a pagan funeral. And like I said, if you watched my Beowulf bonus, you saw all that. Regardless, in the year of our Lord, 616, Edwin and Redwold marched with an army of East Anglian warriors to conquer Athelfrith on the River Idle. Athelfrith was defeated, Edwin became king of Bernicia and Deira, and therefore, as happened to Edwin, now Athelfrith's sons went into exile. Northumbria now is under control of a prince from the Deiran royal family. Now, usually in stories of the bad king being overthrown, it's customary for the new king to be good and right and just. But what made a good king in the 7th century? Being right and just with your own people, sure. But still being a fierce and formidable warlord. Now, Edwin spent the beginning of his reign conquering and becoming overlord of the other kingdoms around him in an attempt to become Bretwalda. Now, I talked about the term Bretwalda in my 5th century video and in my 6th century video as well. I'm going to once again go over the meaning of that. Basically, it's the AngloSaxon word for the most powerful king when Britain was divided into different kingdoms, there was no king of England, but a Bretwalda, who would become Bretwalda by forging alliances and forcing other kingdoms into being subservient to him. First, he conquered the British kingdom of Elmet. Shortly after taking the throne, around 616, maybe a few years after, he also forced submission from the native Britons on the islands of Anglesea and Man. He then extended his power over the other English kingdoms. He seized control over the kingdom of Lindsey in the northeast Midlands, which would thus cease to be a kingdom, and its territories would be passed between Northumbria and Mercia, eventually becoming known as Lincoln. He became allies with Edwald of Kent, marrying his sister Ethelberg. He also offered protection to the Jutes on the Isle of Wight for tribute, and he also forced the West Saxons into submission. But by the 630s, Edwin would finally meet his match in a deadly alliance. First in this alliance was the king of Gwynedd, CAD Wallen ap Cadfan, who I mentioned before when I was talking about Edwin's exile, how it is theorized that Edwin stayed in the court of his father, Cadfan, and they were foster brothers before becoming enemies. That's what Geoffrey of Monmouth claims. We don't know if that's true, but this part is. CAD Wallen was first defeated by Edwin in a squabble and was sent into exile for a few years. I think maybe in Ireland. And he came back to face him stronger with this alliance. Now, first let me say a few things that Bede says about CAD Wallen. He was a brute. He was supposedly a tyrant. He was not like King Arthur, not some freedom fighter for the Britons. In fact, I don't even think he was concerned with any of the other British kingdoms other than his own, unless they were helping his cause in one way or another. Also, according to Bede, he absolutely hated the English and was set on complete ethnic cleansing of the Anglo-Saxons, supposedly putting to death women and children, and despite professing to be a Christian, would still attack monasteries, nunneries, and plunder gold from churches. Bede's claim of him hating all the English is contradicted by the fact that his main ally was English. The last pagan king of the Anglo-Saxons, Penda, the king of Mercia, which takes up much of the Midlands. But it is said that he was not king yet during this battle. So Edwin would face this deadly alliance at the Battle of Hatfield Chase. Hatfield Chase was a major failure for Northumbria. Edwin was no match for Penda and CAD Wallen. Edwin was killed, as well as his son Osfrith. His other son Eadfrith was captured as a prisoner. Edwin's head was carried to York, and Bishop Paulinus escorted his queen, Ethelberg, and the rest of their children back to Kent, and then across the English Channel into Francia. And thus, Northumbria was divided once again. Deira fell to Edwin's cousin Osric, and Eanfrith, the son of Ethelfrith, returned out of exile with his brother to reclaim the throne of Burnie Xie. After Edwin became king, they had gone into exile in the Scotch-Irish Sea Kingdom of Dal Riata. There, they were brought up on Celtic Christianity. However, Eanfrith quickly reverted back to Germanic heathenry after seizing the throne. However, the time of Oswald was soon to begin. The king who defines this period. In fact, My lecture is now at its peak, now that I am talking about Oswald Cunning. Out of all the sons of Athelfrith, he was perhaps the one who the Scotch-Irish monks from Dalriada had the biggest impact on. But before he could become king, he had some work to do. Possibly with an alliance of Scots and Picts, Oswald ambushed CAD Wallen and drove the Welsh from Burnie Xie. But before he did, he supposedly had a vision of the Irish Saint Columba. And it is said that he erected a giant cross near the field of battle, and all his warriors knelt with him, and they prayed for victory, which is how the battlefield got its name, Heavenfield. And if you go to the site today, which is in Hexham, they have an updated cross to commemorate the battle and Oswald's victory. After the battle, he was claimed King of Bernicia and Deira, once again uniting the two into the super kingdom of Northumbria. He also quickly established himself as the new Bretwalda. He already had Dalriada on his side. He also is said to have had control over the old British kingdom of Gododin and the Anglian kingdom of Lindsey. He also was an ally to the West Saxons and was supposedly the godfather to the King of Wessex at the time, Cynegils, and also married his daughter. One of the things Oswald was most remembered for, however, were his saintly deeds. As I said before, him and his brothers were brought up on Celtic Christianity by the monks on Dalriada, which at the time was different from Roman Christianity in a few ways. The dating of Easter, the tonsure that the monks would wear, the more laid-back system of penance, and also more emphasis on hermitage and pilgrimages, going in exile for Christ, so to speak. Now, Christianity was not new to the English at the time, and Roman Christianity had already taken many of the southern Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. It had been for the past 4 decades, due to Italian missionaries coming up from Rome in what was known as the Canterbury Mission, first converting Kent, which is why Canterbury is the spiritual capital of England, and also spreading Christianity through Wessex, East Anglia, and before Oswald brought Celtic Christianity to Northumbria, Edwin had brought, for a brief time, Roman Christianity to the kingdom. For Edwin spent his exile in East Anglia, where that form of Christianity was being heavily preached. It is also suggested that Edwin's Christianity may have been a little more than skin deep, as it was more a conditional conversion, a matter of life and death, even though he is venerated as a saint. Oswald and his brothers, however, were fully enveloped in the mystical world of the Celtic monks on Dalriada, whose monastery was on the island of Iona. So after he took the throne, he spread Celtic Christianity throughout his realm. However, he was not a king associated with persecuting pagans in the name of his religion. From what we can see, he was a king who was mostly known for helping the poor, spreading education. There is a story about how he gave away his Easter meal to the poor, and even broke up the silver platter that the meal was on, and handed out the pieces of silver. All in all, Oswald was considered a good king, or as they say in Beowulf, a god cunning, a king who is fierce in battle, but fair with his people. Emily, wouldn't you say that Oswald was a god cunning?
Oh yes, a gold king indeed!
Now, one of the first things he did as king was order the construction of the Lindisfarne Monastery, a very famous monastery, mostly famous for the Viking attack that happened in the year 793. But around the year 634, Oswald ordered the construction of this monastery. He sent word back to Iona for a bishop. Now, the first bishop they sent, it is said, was trash, could not teach the native population, and he said that Northumbria was a bunch of barbarians. He was too lazy to do his job. The next bishop that Iona sent, however, Bishop Aidan, was the perfect fit for the job. And together, Oswald and Aidan would help turn Lindisfarne into one of the most important learning centers in all of Western Europe throughout the early Middle Ages. The illuminated manuscripts that would be produced there were probably the most significant progression in the evolution of art after the fall of the West Roman Empire. However, the story of Lindisfarne would evolve more by the end of this lecture. So, as I said before, Oswald was not just a big church supporter. He was also a mighty warrior. And in the year 641, he was soon to face his greatest challenge. Now, for much of his reign, Mercia was fairly quiet, and matters between that kingdom and Northumbria were fairly peaceful. And the kingdom was still ruled by that last heathen king of the AngloSaxons, Penda. So, rewinding a bit, going back 8 years, when Edwin was king, he fought against Penda, who was allied with CAD Wallen, and was in the end slain by them. Now, it is said that Penda might have been somewhat accepting of Oswald's rule at first, or at least more so than he was with Edwin, since Oswald and Edwin were enemies too. So it could have been, at first, an enemy of my enemy is my friend situation that could have waned the more Penda just generally began to resent Northumbrian overlordship. So it was the year 642, Penda would challenge Oswald and Northumbria once again, assisted by the Welsh, both from Gwynedd and Powys, at what was known as the Battle of Macer Field, which is thought to have taken place in Oswestry, which is part of Shropshire. Now, Bede's account, as I said before about his writings, is written with a Northumbrian bias. So, since he had a dog in that fight, he really made Oswald out to be the saintly figure in this battle. However, many historians will put Oswald on the offensive and Penda on the defensive, saying that the battle was Penda's response to the expansionism of Northumbria. In the end, Oswald was defeated and slain, and it is even said that the Mercians dismembered his body and sacrificed him to Woden in a pagan ritual. Christian accounts will make Oswald out to be a martyr for his faith after this battle. However, this is contradicted by the fact that this wasn't exactly a spiritual war. Oswald just happened to be Christian, and Penda just happened to be pagan. Oswald may have had pagans fighting in his warband, and the Welsh kingdoms that were allied with Penda were Christian kingdoms. So the truth is, Macer Field was a battle fought over territory, not over religion. Still, this is the battle that turned King Oswald into Saint Oswald. The aftermath of Macer Field was two major things, really. A rise in Mercia's power and influence over the island of Britain, and also Northumbria was now split into two kingdoms once again. Oswald's brother, Oswiu, took the throne of Burnie Xie, for Oswald's son, Ethelwald, was too young to be king. But even though Oswiu became king of Burnie Xie, it was Oswin, the son of Edwin's cousin, Osric, who took the throne of Deira. Now, I realize how confusing all these Oz names are, and I wish I could make it easier. Osric, Oswald, Oswiu, Oswin. It's confusing, especially this feud between Oswiu and Oswin, but try to follow. Oswin was elected as King of Deira by the people because he was supposedly very well liked and, unlike his father, was a Christian. He had the support of the church in York. Now, to Oswiu, this was not okay. He needed to inherit that same power that was passed on from their father. The thrones of Burnie Xie and Deira, the super kingdom of Northumbria. He needed to do something about Oswin. He challenged him to battle, but Oswin was very pacifistic in his Christianity and did not wish to fight, and instead retreated to the home of one of his friends, but his friend betrayed him to Oswiu. Some friend that is. So Oswiu murdered Oswin so he could have both thrones. But before he did that, he had himself married to King Edwin's daughter, Anfled, who had still been in exile in Kent. So he married himself to Edwin's line and also murdered someone related to Edwin to further secure his throne. We can only wonder how Oswiu's bride felt about him murdering her second cousin. But as I said at the beginning of this lecture, the 7th century was a very different time. Furthermore, historical records paint Oswiu out in general to be way more of a jerk than Oswald was. So Oswin of Deira was canonized as a saint, and his followers say that if he had died not for the faith of Christ, then for the justice of Christ. In other words, some Christian Oswiu is. But Oswiu quickly attempted to redeem himself by building a monastery, Gilling Abbey. Good save, Oswiu. It is said, however, that it was his wife Anflad who had him do that. And it is also said that after this murder, the throne of Deira would have been taken by his nephew, though Oswiu likely could have installed him as a puppet king who he could use for his ambitions. There's another interesting thing about this whole Anfled thing, and that is that Oswiu was already married to a princess from the native British kingdom of Reged named Rheahenmelth. What happened to her? That information is lost to time. Either way, after all these dynastic scandals took place, tensions with Mercia began to rise, tensions that had been brewing since Macer Field. Bede, speaking from a Northumbrian bias, will often paint Penda out to be the villain, but it seems more likely that he was more on the defensive, resisting the spread of the expansionist kingdom of Northumbria. He may have been more concerned with maintaining his own land. And it also doesn't seem like religion played a very big part in these conflicts either. As I said in the beginning of this lecture, and also when I was talking about Macer Field, most of these wars were territorial. It was just convenient that Penda happened to be a pagan, and Northumbria happened to be a Christian kingdom. And Christianity happened to be spreading rapidly. So, and it seems like Penda didn't necessarily have a problem with Christianity. He allowed Christians in his kingdom, and he even allowed his children to be baptized. So Penda really could have just been extremely progressive and one of the earliest promoters of the separation of church and state. But we will never know because everything we know about him is written by his enemies. Penda did attack Bebbanburg, however, around this time. He burned the fortress, and supposedly the smoke from the fire reached the Lindisfarne monastery, where Bishop Aidan was praying in his chamber, and the smoke reached him and killed him. However, attempts at peace were made between Mercia and Northumbria. Strangely enough, Oswiu and Penda tried to marry their children to each other. Oswiu's son Aelfrith married Penda's daughter Cuthbert, and Oswiu's daughter Aelfled was married to Penda's son Penda. They were baptized, and as I said before, Penda didn't seem to have a problem with the baptism, but the peace was pretty artificial. Penda still attacked Burnie Xie in the year 655 with a considerably large host. Oswiu attempted diplomacy, offering payment to Penda, but Penda refused. He just wanted to fight. And in that year, 655, the Battle of the Winway happened, which was fought around modern-day Leeds. Apparently, Penda had allies from Wales and East Anglia, and he marched supposedly with 30 warlords to battle. In addition, for some reason, Ethelwald of Deira, Oswald's son and Oswiu's nephew, ended up fighting on the side of the Mercians. Now, this reason is thought to have been out of resentment for Oswiu's unjust murder of Oswin, which sounds very probable. He did retreat, however, to witness the rest of the battle from a distance. Maybe the guilt overcame him, who knows. But the most important thing about this battle is that it is Penda's last stand. Oswiu overpowered Penda and killed him, and this halted the rise of Mercia that we saw after Macer Field. And thus, the rest of the century saw Northumbrian dominance once again. In fact, Northumbria now controlled the whole northern part of Mercia, and the south of Mercia was ruled by Penda's son Penda, who had been baptized. So any way you slice it, Mercia is now ruled by a Christian king for the first time. After Penda's defeat, Oswiu built a monastery in York called Whitby, which was a co-ed monastery, also a nunnery. It became one of the most important spiritual centers in northern England, mostly from how close it lay to the frontier of Mercia. It was in a good central location, and everyone in Whitby, from what we hear, had pretty happy lives. And the woman that Oswiu chose to be the abbess of the nunnery was perhaps, along with his wife Aelfled, one of the most important female players in this period. Her name was Lady Hilda, and she was the grandniece of Edwin and part of the Deira royal family, which may have been awkward for both of them, the fact that they were both akin to two feuding royal families. Let's not forget that Oswiu's father tried to kill Edwin, and Oswiu too was nobody's younger brother when it came to assassination and even kinslaying if it was to secure the throne. But let's not ponder too much about that. Oswiu appointed Lady Hilda as the abbess of Whitby. It is also important to note that at Whitby, as well as other co-ed monasteries that are part monastery, part nunnery, the abbess ran the monastery. She ran both the nuns and the monks. So Lady Hilda pretty much ran the whole show at Whitby. Now also, around this time, Celtic Christianity was huge. It was spreading all throughout England. I spoke earlier of the difference between Roman Christianity and Celtic Christianity at the time, and how the north was Celtic and the south was Roman. Well, around the end of the 7th century, Celtic Christianity was spreading further into the south even, as far south as Essex, which is where London is. This created a problem for Canterbury, which was in the Kingdom of Kent, which I'm sure we all know about the Archbishopric of Canterbury, the spiritual capital of England pretty much since the first Anglo-Saxon king who was baptized a century earlier. Now, however, we have more Christians turning to Lindisfarne, Whitby, and Iona as their main spiritual centers. not Canterbury. Mercia, however, still having tensions with Northumbria, decided to ally themselves with Canterbury and follow in the Roman tradition, as if to still agree to become Christian like Northumbria wanted, but still be like, hey, up yours. But either way, tensions were high at this time between the Roman Church and the Celtic Church, and much of it had to do with the dating of Easter. Because apparently, if you can't even get the time of the year right that Jesus resurrected from the cross, then are you even Christian? The other issue was the way the monks cut their hair. Now, like I said before, Celtic monks pretty much wore skullets. The Roman monks wore the more familiar monk haircut, like a ring of hair around the head with the top shaved. That was an issue too, but definitely not as much of an issue as Easter. The overall issue, I would say, however, was that England wasn't all following one church. There needed to be one church, and it needs to be the Roman one. Now, this was long before the Catholic and Protestant issue. In the 7th century, it was Celtic Christian and Roman Christian. So here we enter one of the most important things to occur towards the end of the 7th century, the Synod of Whitby. Oswiu and his son and a number of nobles and churchmen gathered at Whitby to decide whether England's church would be Celtic or Roman. Both sides had a number of reasonable arguments against their claim. The Celtic Christians argued that they were following in the tradition of the most holy of Saints Columba, the Irish saint, who spread Christianity amongst the Picts and was pretty much the founder of the whole monastic system they all followed. And he himself was a follower of St. John the Evangelist. Those who favored Roman Christianity, however, seems to have better arguments, that it was practiced in Rome, where the apostles had lived, taught, and suffered, that it was the universal practice of the church as far as Egypt. Now, the customs of St. John the Evangelist were particular to the needs of his community and his age, and since then, the Council of Nicaea had established a different practice, and that Columba simply didn't know any better. Ignorance can be an excuse, but you can't be taught the right way and then try to deny it. And finally, nobody in the church had authority over St. Peter's successor, the Bishop of Rome, His Holiness the Pope. And so it was that all of the AngloSaxon Christians would be followers of Roman Christianity, not Celtic Christianity. This might have been a very difficult decision for Oswiu. After all, he grew up in exile, being raised on Celtic Christianity by the monks on Iona. But on the other hand, Oswiu was not a man to let his personal relationships get in the way of power, and following the Roman way would have given him the power that the Christian rulers on the continent would have held. As a result, the episcopal seat of Northumbria was moved from Lindisfarne further south to York. Lindisfarne, however, would still continue to be an important learning center, and it was in the decades following the Synod of Whitby that the community there really started growing, and the illuminated manuscripts became more elaborate. We also see another important figure rise up, a figure who was very important throughout the following 400 years of the Anglo-Saxon period, for his legacy and the relics associated with him. Of course, I am talking about Saint Cuthbert. Now, Cuthbert was born around the time of Edwin, and he grew up surrounded by Celtic Christianity in his kingdom. This would have been what he was taught when he would have first become part of the church, especially since he pretty much reached adulthood during the time when tension between the Roman and Celtic churches were at a peak. In the end, Cuthbert conformed to the Roman way in some ways. He may have observed the Roman Easter and cut his hair like a Roman monk, but the practice of hermitage was not lost on him. I would say that he followed these small Roman details, but he was still very much a Celtic Christian at heart. For a while, he was the prior at a monastery in a place called Ripon. He retired in 676 to take the life of a hermit and meditate on the Holy Spirit, a very mystical practice that the Celtic monks practiced a lot. A few years later, in 684, he was offered the bishopric of Hexham, but was hesitant to give up his life of a hermit. After being visited by a large group of people, including the king at the time, Oswigu's son Egfrith, he would be convinced to take the life of a bishop. But not at Hexham, at Lindisfarne. St. Cuthbert would from then on be associated with the Lindisfarne monastery. But a lot of that has to do with the centuries after his death, like during the Viking Age. Alfred the Great famously had a vision of him that gave him hope for victory over the Danes. And in 875, when the Vikings attacked the Lindisfarne monastery for a second time, after doing it like 80 years prior, the monks took the body of St. Cuthbert, which was buried there, and hid in various places with it. So they were literally just going across the Northumbrian countryside with a coffin that had a corpse in it, fleeing from the Vikings. So after the death of Cuthbert in 687, the monks there began preparing a shrine and also preparing a set of Gospels that would be made as a tribute to him. This, of course, was the Lindisfarne Gospels, which would be officially produced between the years 715 and 720. But the seeds of these Gospels were really planted right after Cuthbert's death in 687, when all of these things were being done in tribute to him. So the work goes through the Gospels of the four evangelists, and each of the evangelists had their own symbol. Matthew had the man, representing the human Christ. Mark had the lion, symbolizing the triumphant Christ of the resurrection. Luke was the calf, symbolizing the sacrificial victim of the crucifixion. And John was the eagle, symbolizing Christ's second coming. And the texts are still in good condition, despite all the Viking raids and the Norman conquest and all of that. Around the time that these manuscripts would be produced, however, Northumbria's power as the most dominant kingdom in England had really begun to wane in favor of Mercia. But Mercia's power wasn't anything new. It was something that was threatening to Northumbria since the beginning of this period. You see, Northumbria was powerful because it was a combination of two powerful kingdoms. It was connected to the Irish Church, and since Ethelfrith, you had the tradition of Bernician kings making themselves Bretwalda. Mercia, however, is in the Midlands, so it's located in such a great central location between all the other kingdoms. You have all these options of kingdoms that a king may try to expand his frontiers into. Plus, it had become the largest in size. Northumbria was the most powerful because of the dominance the kings had over the other kingdoms, but Mercia was the largest kingdom. The only thing throughout the 7th century really keeping it from becoming as powerful as it can be was you had a king who refused to give up paganism. But after his Christian sons took the throne, Mercia's power succeeded Northumbria, a power that grew and grew throughout the 8th century and reached its peak in 757 with King Offa, an emperor-like king who we will all be learning about in my next lecture. Now, if you want to get into a good fiction series about this time period, I highly recommend the Burnie Xie Chronicles by Matthew Harvey. Amazing, amazing books. They go through all of the events that I just talked about, but they place a fictional character named Beobrand into the story, who goes from farmer to warrior and faces all kinds of trials and tribulations on the way. There are 6 of them. The 7th one should be out later this summer, and there is currently a TV show in production based on the series. You can follow the progress of it on Facebook. It is being done independently, and the more buzz they create, the better the chance that it will get full funding and distributed to a streaming service. So follow the Facebook page and read the books. Seriously, they are amazing. Wastu Hall.